I'm going to talk about my childhood experience and on war and conflict in simple words, and I'll try to put this subject in the perspective mainly in the context of Cyprus and literary theory. I read to save times from the paper. First of all, I should say that the theme of war is not strange to Cyprus. Its 3,000 years long history, poetry history, begin with war poems actually. Stasinos, one of the poets from the 8th century BC, wrote Cyprian epic, Cypria. This ancient epic stands amongst those peripheral pioneers of the Homerus epics, and some researchers claim that the Iliad actually is a result of it. Though there are some differences between them. The Iliad narrates the conflict during and the events after the Trojan War. The Cyprian epic displays the reasons that paved the way for war with different points of view. Besides this, Stasinos voice this narration with Eastern myth, particularly Phoenician ones, and also the influence of Aphrodite cult, more visible. As you know, since Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was born in Cyprus, her nickname is Cypriot, Gyprei. There were many more ancient poets from Cyprus, actually, who had fame from Egypt to Epirus in the Greek-speaking world that made Cyprus one of the founders of European literature. Many years later, in the 12th century, Saint Neophytos became another important milestone poet with his representation of Byzantine Orthodox tradition and mysticism. Again, we can see many texts, both in Greek Cypriot dialect and partly Latin, first in French, then Italian languages in medieval times, and in the early modern and modern era, in Ottoman Turkish and English, or in a mixed languages text, kept talking about the endless wars. Although our country has always had more than one language in thousands of years of history, Greek was the one of which represented continuity as the most important literary language and mixed with the other communities' languages. Greek was also the languages that I felt comfortable with when I socialized with other kids in my childhood neighborhood before the intercommunal conflicts and the war. My mother tongue is Turkish, which my family spoke in its variations, such as Ottoman Turkish, Istanbul Turkish, Cypriot Turkish. I have published a literary study on the literatures of Cyprus, Greece, and Turkey, entitled Steppe Mother Tongue. It was originally written in English while I was a lecturer in London. These three languages of my homeland Cyprus interwoven in my literary works. My books are written in Turkish, but some lines of my poems or parts of my novels are in Greek, even in Greek letter Turkish, which we call Karamannitika. I sometimes find myself translating not only words, but cultural concepts, imageries from Greek into Turkish. Since my spoken Greek is not good enough, I surprise myself how suddenly some lines come out in Greek or translated from Greek and sometimes from English in the writing process. My English is likewise my Greek. I am culturally much more connected with Hellenic and British traditions than my broken spoken languages of them may imply. One can expect that someone like me, who came from a cosmopolitan background family in a linguistically and culturally mixed country, will be a perfect multilingual person. But I am not exactly like that. The war turned me to a multiple non-lingual one. As I wrote in one of my poems, that poem also translated into Japanese, wartime, I used to talk within myself so that no one could hear me. And they all suspected wisdom in my silence. Turkish was dangerous, must not be spoken, and Greek was absolutely forbidden. My elders who wanted to save me were waiting, each one trigger ready before a machine gun. Anyway, everyone was a willing soldier. English remained right in the middle, a slender paper knife for cutting school books, a tongue to be spoken at certain times, especially with Greeks. I was often unsure in which language to shed tears. The life I lived wasn't foreign, but one of translation. My mother tongue one thing, my motherland another, and I again altogether different. Even in those days of blackouts, it became obvious I could never be the poet of any country because I belonged to a minority. And freedom still a little word uneasy in any nation's lexicon. Then in my poems, the three languages got into a wild tangle. Neither the Turks nor the Greeks could hear my inner voice, nor the others. But I don't blame them. It was wartime. I experienced the terror of war and the division through languages. During the years of ethnic conflicts in Cyprus, the Turkish military authorities were punishing Turkish Cypriots by making them pay a penalty for each Greek word they used. It was forbidden even to listen to Greek songs, forget the singing. To lose a so-called mother tongue and to have a mother tongue are obviously parts of the same nationalization process. When Dionysios Solomos, one of the founders of modern Greek poetry, aimed to be a Greek national poet during the independence war against Ottoman Empire, wanted to learn Greek language and custom better than his Italian lingual and cultural background. And in order to write poems in a rich Greek, he paid money to Greek-speaker villagers to improve his Greek vocabulary. But at the end of the day, the Italian and the Greek languages and poetry traditions mixed up in his supposedly pure Greek languages and poem. Most probably my Turkish writing poems are also similar in that sense of hybridity. It doesn't matter whether poets choose to hide or expose their hybrid poetic resources, the hybridity exists there. It is the war that divides us, but poetry with its multiple resources from different languages and literary traditions unites us. Therefore, I can find a common fate with Dionysios Solomos. One of our main differences with him is I was forced to pay money to forget the Greek language, while he voluntarily paid to make it memorable. It seems that the language are one of the main excuses in the nationalist wars. Turkey claimed in 1974 that Turkish-speaking Cypriots are identical with Turkish nations. Actually, they don't, and needed to be liberated by military invasion of the island against the Greek junta's coup d'etat. And today, Russia has a similar claim based on so-called motherlands, assuming whoever speaks Russian is a part of its nationhood, and this justifies the terrifying occupation in Ukraine. We need to question this anachronistic nationalist approach of the mother tongues, which are supposedly pure, centralized, homogeneous, and are not mixed up with any other mother tongues. And why it is usually connected to the concept of motherland in the modernist literary discourses of nation-state eras. I personally never experienced monolingualism or pure mother tongues. When I was a child, I didn't know that the languages define our so-called identities. We had Armenian neighbors who spoke Turkish better than many Turkish Cypriots. At one of my cousins' homes, they mainly spoke in English because of mixed marriage with a British lady, and another cousin was married to a Greek Cypriot lady, and they replied to each other in both Greek and Turkish dialects of Cyprus, which we call it Kypriaga. One of our neighbors from Alexandrian Greek, and just like our tenant who was from Ankara, they spoke in Greek and Turkish, different dialects of Cypriots. Cypriot people, whatever their ethnic roots, has a common folk poetry tradition, usually mixed with Turkish and Italian words in the Greek dialect of Cyprus, and orally performed by folk poets called bidarides. These poems, just like Japanese poetry, use the imaginaries and metaphors of nature and are also wiser than some modernist literary works. Ironically, these traditional poems performed by different ethno-religious origin Cypriot village poets could have some more cosmopolitan quality than of those national recognized mainstream ones written in the line of mainland Greek or in Turkish poetries. It is interesting to observe that these local, peripheral poems open a window onto global discourses, a multilingual, multicultural approach more than the canonized national poetries in the last century. Their languages and literary tendencies are much more representative of daily life, collective social psychology, and common culture of Cypriot people as a whole. Perhaps precisely this is the reason that intercommunal conflicts and the war made them not visible enough. But this is such a strong poetic and literary source that offers us a cultural base to reunite our forcefully divided homeland. I'll read another poem that show how I experience of my childhood neighborhood, the languages. Marika's Mustafa. Floral window pane in the gardener's hut. Please don't tell on me. I saw them through the clear heads of the flowers. Oh yes, I did, floral window pane. Mustafa steps out of the bath, dripping naked. He stretches and sways, erect in front of Marika. Mustafa must be a bit crazy. Calmly his wife too begins to strip. Oh fuchsia, on the gardener's window pane. As they both tremble around stark naked, intertwine, like two babies really, neither Greek nor Turkish, their birth talk. Little fuchsia, flowers like earrings. I understood nothing. Oh fuchsia, are they earrings, their moans and groans as they wrestle? Marika's Mustafa is crazy. Marika is even crazier. Earrings, dingle. My family tree has produced many poets, authors, and literary figures in the last 2 centuries. But almost each literary person's work in my family was a victim of a different identity politics. Names of them became widely known, mostly because of the collective political interpretation of their literary texts. The aesthetic quality of their works decreased as much as their necessity for specific collective ethno-religious identities in a small community in war increased. Perhaps I will talk more about the shifting of identities and metaphors in poetry from the war to war at the following panel discussion with other colleagues. But now I can just give you an example from my father, Mehmet Yashin, who was known as national poet of Turkish Cypriots, became more nationalist during the wartime from the mid-60s to the mid-70s. Another well-known Cypriot poet, my mother's cousin, Taner Beybers, left Cyprus for London in the 50s and never returned back to the country because the destruction of the intercommunal conflicts and the war were unbearable for him. Then he was acknowledged as a British author too and considered one of the most important English-writing Cypriot poets. He became more religious as a Catholic believer and moved to France where he began writing in French. Taner Beybers was one of the first translators of Nazım Hikmet, a prominent modern Turkish poet, onto English. Under Cold War policies, it was very courageous for a Turk to translate Nazım Hikmet, who was accused of being a traitor in Turkey, and put in prison, then exiled. But since Taner Beybers was not from Turkey, he actualized the translation without experienced political oppression. These translations include Nazım Hikmet's famous poem about a little girl who died at Hiroshima. If a poet would share the pains of the other side at the conflict and refuse to be part of nationalist hysteria of wartime, can easily be accused as traitor. I also experienced this because I didn't accept to be a spokesperson of only one side about the war. My first poetry collection, which was published in Istanbul in 1984, talked about sufferings of Greek origin Cypriot people due to Turkey's military occupation in 1974 and the following Turkish colonization on the island. It was banned by the military junta in Istanbul at the same time. It won the Turkish Academy Poetry Prize. I was only 25 years old when Turkish authorities declared me enemy of Turkish national interests and put me in prison, then deported me from the country. When an author is sent to exile for political reasons, he named author in exile, and his work is categorized as exile literature. Hegemonic power attempts to assign an extra or counter-literary identity to the author. Even further, the author is forced to write himself through such anti-literary categorizations. Discourses of the literary canons are informed by such political categorizations of authorship that by default reproduce the political subjection, particularly during the wars that the authors have already experienced. Counter-hegemonic discourses in literature sometimes end up reproducing the conditions for organized power, even though we often do not perceive it. For this reason, I was very careful in my professional life not to reproduce, rebound, or re-exile concepts around my literary works. By carrying these terms from the arena of crude political power or wartime to the domain of literature, we can determine the fate of a poet in even more dangerous way. Instead of associating him with poetry and literature, literary circles also associate him with what is banned or exiled. By using such discourses, they may turn to the fate that political repression, even under the condition of war, cannot on its own assign to an author onto the author's actual written fate. Therefore, if a poet experienced the war and wrote against it and faced being banned and exiled, then he or she should learn how to protect his or her works against these default literary discourses too. I wrote my first poetry collection between the ages of 17 and 23 without intended a deliberate political statement. My only fault was writing poems on the destruction of the war and human suffering regardless of their ethnic origins. Here is some lines from my first poetry collection. They were written while I was 19 years old. A poem of those days which didn't belong to us. Was your name Estella? The aunt who lived in this house before us. Did you have children? And this picture on the wall, was it taken on your wedding day, dear aunt? Was your name Estella? Was it you who used to hang the washing on the balcony before us? On the wall tiles, are they your fingerprints and your voice is still vibrating in the rooms? Oh, my aunt, dear aunt. I am very curious to know who was this Greek Cypriot reading this book. He stopped on page 48. Perhaps he was called up at that very moment. And that is more. What is more? The title is Man is Not Born a Soldier. We could have shared memories, eaten ice cream together. I might have dressed the wound on your hand, been able to wear your raincoat on a wet day. I would have liked you to know of my surprise myself, how I can continue with your unfinished book here, like that. After many years of rapprochement, now the poem I just read, some parts of it, is in the school books of the Republic of Cyprus, alongside with a Greek-writing Cypriot poet, Pandelis Mekanikos' poem entitled Ode to a Murdered Turkish Boy. Another important poet in the contemporary Cypriot poetry is Kostas Montis, but he had more nationalistic approach during the anti-colonial struggle and the intercommunal conflicts in Cyprus than Pandelis Mekanikos. He also wrote a prose book to challenge Lawrence Durrell's Bitter Lemons, claiming that Lawrence Durrell, who worked for the British colonial government in Cyprus, deliberately talked about the cosmopolitan quality and non-Hellenic cultures, some Eastern connections of Cypriots, in order to cover up the Greekness of the island. Yet, Kostas Montis was a true representative of Cypriotness. While using Attiki Athenian dialect in his own writing, he translated Aristophanes into Greek Cypriot dialect, Kypriaka, so people can understand better. He reminds me of my father. They both had common Cypriot cultural traditions, shared a similar lifestyle, which was quite multicultural compared with Greece and Turkey in the 1950s. And yet, they assumed that they were identical with only Greek and Turkish nations rather than each other. In fact, Cypriots don't need to ignore many different rich cultural influences on their country in order to be part of the Hellenic world, because it has been there for thousands of years. I should add that Kostas Montis had a dedicated and generous literary personality. He even came to my poetry reading day in my early ages, while my father never did. My father was so upset that I publicly challenged his nationalistic poems against the other Cypriot community with harsh words of youthfulness. Poetry helped me to understand during the war, while I was a teenager, that I must defend the rights of the others who were presented to me as enemies, not the aggressor who acted in my name. But if a Turkish origin Cypriot, particularly the one whose family reproduces collective culture of its community, shows empathy and care to Greek origin neighbors in the war, that person must be punished more than anyone else. This is the rule of war. No one would listen to your humanitarian reasons. We can resist it only with poetry. The ears may not hear what you say in discussions, but poetry makes hearts to hear. Our family home and neighboring houses of our relatives were attacked by ultranationalist paramilitary Greeks a decade ago from the Turkish military occupation. it is looted. My aunt and grandmother sent to war prisoner camps at a monastery. Some of my cousins were killed, and some of them is still missing. And then my childhood home in the last cosmopolitan neighborhood of the capital city was burned down. Therefore, I was expected to victimize myself forever, having no empathy, no caring for my Greek Cypriot neighbors who were also victims of the wars. I did the opposite. I even used Stella's name, one of our neighbors who participated in the looting and burning of our home, in a completely opposite way in the poem which I just read. It seems to me that poets unintentionally select part of their memories and reinterpret them. And in the writing process, the fictional ones turn into reality. I am not sure if a poet writes about what he lives, or if he lives in what he writes, or if the answer is both. Poetic space relates to the language of the soul and the images of consciousness. Perhaps it was sufficient on the theme of war and poetry to talk here only about my childhood home. Obviously, that place is an immense source of poetic images that always come to me with intensity and intimacy. Perhaps a poet, particularly the ones who experience wars, need to be haunted by the ghosts of his or her childhood house. Even more, he needs to self-exile himself from the so-called real world and turn into his own ghost. In my poems entitled A Ghost, a phantom returned to his home to take care of it, but by doing this, it means to take revenge from the war, because he strives to keep alive a place that was killed. A ghost. Phoenician inscribers of epitaphs were killed by warriors who were Phoenicians themselves because they advocated an end to the war with the Greeks. And those who remain continue to live like ghosts under threat of death. From a tombstone in Italian, Cyprus, 8th century BC. Only as a ghost can I now return to my own home. Emerging from blurred window mirrors, I haven't much time. I throw the windows open in pitch dark, starlight floats the rooms. I shake the dust of the curtains off the linen drap over bookshelves. I must also clean with moist breath the family pictures in frames. The avenging angels of this polyglot house was silenced. Make everyone who enters it promise to write against wars, against everything, jingoes, even tongues. Sprinkle the end killer around like enchanted words, the mothball. I wipe the floor clean, I lock the doors, and I am off again. No one has even seen me. I am a phantom. They can't have me killed. Thank you very much.